every now and I feel fine.
While mounting backlash today over a comment President Obama made about the salary of his outgoing press secretary, Robert Gibbs. According to the New York Times, in an interview, the president said, speaking of Gibbs, he's had a 6-year stretch now where basically he's been going 24/7 with relatively modest pay. Gibbs makes $172,000 a year. Does that sound modest to you? Jason Lewis is a syndicated radio host of The Jason Lewis Show and author of Power Divided is Power Checked. And Bernard Whitman is a Democratic strategist and a former President Clinton pollster. All right, gentlemen, so already the president's critics have come out and said he sounds really tone deaf and out of touch to be asking people to be empathetic to the poor victim Robert Gibbs and his $172,000 a year, Jason.
Well, you know, this wasn't a modest salary when the president wanted to tax everybody in that bracket. Democrats have been lamenting the top 5% of income earners in the country for decades now as part of their class warfare rhetoric, and $172,000 puts Robert Gibbs in the top 5%, not shy of that magic, or not far shy from that magic $200,000 figure that the president said needed to be taxed more. So what is it? Is it a modest salary that is run-of-the-mill for Americans that shouldn't be subject to new taxes, or are they part of the rich that the Democrats have been complaining about for years? You can't have it both ways.
Bernard, but what the president said was relatively modest pay, and it seems like what he was referring to was the amount that Gibbs could be making, you know, a man of his education and now having held this position, if he were to go out and be in the private sector or, you know, pursue some government-related job where, you know, he could use his background to better financial advantage.
Megan, I don't think there's any question that the guy has earned his pay. He has been the chief spokesperson for the administration, which means he's the chief spokesperson for the United States government. He's basically on call 24/7, working probably 18, 20 hours a day. So I don't think there's any question about that. Was he well compensated? Yes, he was well compensated. Should he be taxed at that upper income level? Of course he should be. The question is, was he compensated more than the average American? The answer is yes. But what really
average American family pulls in $55,000.
Yeah, but what really concerns me about this, Megan, is this is an inside the Beltway sideshow that distracts us from the very real problems facing America. You know,
but people care. But Bernard, this is why it's relevant, because people fairly ask whether the president gets it, whether he is tone deaf. Does he understand that to the average American, $172,000 a year is a really nice salary?
The average American wants the deficit closed. And instead, we're talking about Robert Gibbs' salary instead of talking about the fact that the first thing the Republicans did when they took office is try to repeal the health care bill, which the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says is going to add $230 billion to the deficit.
Bernard,
the
other
thing is a sideshow.
Here I am, the point. That's a point of a different segment. You're on this segment where we're not talking about that. We're talking about whether the president said something he shouldn't have said that will alienate him from regular Americans. Jason, I'll let you take it.
The American people want the deficit closed, and Democrats like Bernard have been saying we've got to tax the upper income earners. Certainly the top 5% of income earners in the country are upper income, and yet you call that a modest salary. So is your position that you want to tax people with modest incomes? And that's the problem with your class war rhetoric. You can't have it both ways.
It's not class war rhetoric.
It certainly is when you call somebody's salary modest, but yet they need a tax hike.
Look. The president was referring to what he could make if he were in the private sector. Should he have used the word modest? Of course not. Was he referring to what he could make outside the government? Yes, he was. I'm sure Robert Gibbs, if you asked him, would be more than happy to pay his fair share of taxes like all Americans. We have
so you want to raise taxes on modest income?
I feel like you guys are both off point. You're both off point. It's not a question of whether Robert Gibbs should pay tax. I mean, of course, he's going to pay his taxes. I get your point, Jason, that it's, you know, in one scenario he calls somebody like Gibbs rich, and in this scenario he calls it modest. But he said relatively modest. He seemed to be referencing what Gibbs could earn in the real world. But the point is, does it alienate him from a public that is struggling with an over 9% unemployment rate and average Americans pulling in $55,000 a year? Do they really want to hear their president, Bernard, come out and talk about almost $200,000 a year as almost playing the victim for poor Robert Gibbs, who now is about to go out and make probably 7 figures now that he leaves this job?
I think the fact is the president was being a little generous. Should he have said that? Of course not. Can it alienate people that are struggling to keep their jobs at $55,000? Of course so. It was a bad statement But the point is, he has served the country well. He was adequately compensated for it. God bless him.
Yeah,
and I think he's going to do very, very well advocating for the administration from the outside.
Megan and Bernard, could we please could we disabuse ourselves of this notion that these people in government, why, if they were in the private sector, they could be making this? That's absolute hogwash. Gibbs will make 7 figures now because he got the government job, not because he could have made it in the private sector beforehand. It's a totally different situation. You have no idea what you can make in the private sector, and if you can make that kind of money, go do it. But this notion that government employees deserve the same pay is hogwash.
Jason, I think I'll tell you something. The chief communications officer for a Fortune 100 company, which is effectively what Robert Gibbs is, makes about $1 million a year. So the fact is he absolutely could make more money, and he chose public service instead. I'm going to get to the bottom of this.
I'm going to email Dana Perino right now and find out exactly how much money she's making right at this moment. I'll report back shortly. Not
You're
really.
assuming he could have got the job.
Not really. All right, Jason and Bernard, thank you both so much.
Thanks, Megan. Happy New Year.